As many have already guessed, today we're talking about a representative of Hollywood's largest diaspora, the Australian one. This representative is none other than Chris Hemsworth. Chris didn't arrive in Hollywood alone, he brought his entire family along, much like the Baldwin brothers. So now we have Chris Hemsworth and a few more budget-friendly versions of him. Chris himself is quite an interesting guy. In Hollywood, he's one of the best at playing the unlucky card, a grimmer version of Margot Robbie. By the way, she's also from Australia, so they have a lot in common, except that instead of Barbie, Chris has Marvel Studios movies. In Disney's series about guys and gals in colorful tights, he's one of the most intriguing and striking characters. The box office numbers for all those films are fantastic, but as soon as Chris tries to star in a movie without his hammer, he's immediately struck by a box office flop. Bad luck follows him even in films where he doesn't play the lead role. With such an unusual track record, the actor risks becoming a black mark in Hollywood, meaning studios might start avoiding casting him just to not tempt the wrath of the gods. It will be very interesting to watch his career if or when something happens to the Marvel Universe and his lifeline as Thor disappears. That universe is frequently being buried nowadays, and there are all kinds of rumors about its reboot after Secret Wars *, which is scheduled to be released around 2027. Perhaps the countdown for Chris's career has already begun.
Born to fight, apply the heat. Through the smoke and flame, I remain, yeah, I can't be beat. Built to last, I'm surpassing anything they got, give it up, they ain't lasting. Take him down to the ground now, yeah, I hit him hard, juggernaut, yeah, I run this town. I got the fire deep in my bones, in this core, yeah, I'll win the crown.
Chris entered the world of big cinema, like many Australians, through Australian TV series. These shows are typically of little interest to anyone outside of Australia, so actors have limited opportunities to break through. However, as we know, some get lucky. Chris spent several years jumping between various projects and roles until he encountered that very stroke of luck. He landed a role in the Australian series Home and Away. This series boasts over 8,000 episodes, having premiered in 1988 with new episodes still airing today. Chris appeared in 170 episodes from 2004 to 2007. In the early 2000s, the show's ratings began to decline, prompting the creators to cast actors and actresses with model-like looks to attract a younger audience. This decision drew significant criticism at the time, as the acting of the new young cast was often subpar. Nevertheless, the ratings improved. As you might have guessed, Chris joined the series during this wave of young talent recruitment. Since the show was hugely popular in Australia and frequently won local awards, Hemsworth also received recognition, first as Best Newcomer and later as Best Young Actor. In 2007, Chris decided it was time to conquer Hollywood. After leaving the series, he began actively attending auditions in the United States, eventually landing a role in the movie Star Trek. Luck played a role here as well. Director J.J. Abrams initially wanted Matt Damon to play the father of Chris Pine's character in the film. While Abrams didn't specify why Damon turned down the role, he mentioned that the actor's refusal was entirely reasonable. Abrams himself believed that an actor of Damon's caliber might have distracted the audience. As a result, the role went to the then unknown Chris Hemsworth, who fit the part perfectly. Star Trek performed well at the box office and even better in home media sales. However, Chris secured his next role in A Perfect Getaway before Star Trek was even released in theaters. Without the success of Star Trek, it's possible his career trajectory might have been very different. A Perfect Getaway hit theaters 3 months after Star Trek, but was a commercial failure, grossing only $22 million against a $14 million budget. Things were even worse with his next project, Cash. This film was released in the US on just 27 screens. The revenue per screen was so low that the studio chose not to expand its theatrical release, and the movie quickly moved to home video. Its total gross was about $50,000 on a $7 million budget. With such a track record, Hemsworth's career seemed poised to end there. However, Star Trek gave him a chance to be part of the otherwise unremarkable films of that era. And while Cash was sinking fast at the box office, Chris was already on set, wielding Mjolnir as the god of thunder. To land the role of Thor, Chris Hemsworth had to outshine his own brother. At the time, neither of them was particularly in demand, and this was the turning point that separated the Hemsworth brothers into premium and budget categories. Both were shortlisted for the final audition, along with Alexander Skarsgård. Ultimately, the role went to Chris. Both Chris and Liam later insisted there were no hard feelings and that everything worked out well. To prepare for the role of Thor, Chris embarked on an intense 6-month training regimen, combining gym sessions with a strict diet to bulk up. He gained so much muscle that he no longer fit into the original costume, which had to be redesigned to avoid ripping in inconvenient places. Hemsworth shared that the stunt coordinators spent a long time trying to find a fighting style suitable for his character. At one point, they considered incorporating moves inspired by old-school action films. However, when it became clear that Chris had the agility of a beer keg in his new physique, they settled on a style resembling boxing. Many still remember the skepticism surrounding films about a spandex-clad American hero and the God of Thunder. In 2011, Marvel was still a relatively untested cinematic force. Despite industry doubts, the first Thor was received fairly well. With a budget of $150 million, it grossed $449 million worldwide. While it didn't match the success of the first Iron Man, it was still a box office hit. The same couldn't be said for Captain America, the First Avenger, which followed shortly after Thor, but that's a story for another time. Chris quickly caught the attention of dozens of producers, all eager to cast him in prominent roles. However, before he started turning down offers, he appeared in a couple of films he had signed on for prior to Thor. One of these films was shot back in 2009, shortly after Star Trek. While The Cabin in the Woods likely wouldn't have hurt his career, it featured a small but memorable role. Red Dawn was a different story. That film was the textbook definition of a career killer. In 1984, Red Dawn became a major box office hit, grossing $38 million in the US alone on a $4 million budget. For several years, the studio tried to come up with a sequel to the film, but eventually, the idea fizzled out. Then, in 2008, MGM decided to make a remake. Initially, the villains in the film were supposed to be terrorists. However, when the script was completed, someone decided that the idea of America being taken over by terrorists seemed too far-fetched. So, it was decided to use the Chinese instead. The film went into production with this setup. The budget was planned to be $60 million. To save more money for visual effects and equipment, the studio decided to cast actors through open calls. At that time, Chris Hemsworth had just appeared in Star Trek. Many liked him there. He was big and willing to work for cheap, so he was quickly approved for a role. The problems with the film began after shooting, and the variety of these problems makes it hard to pinpoint the main one. Perhaps they all work together. At the beginning of 2010, MGM decided to go bankrupt again. Additionally, one of the producers noted that Chinese invaders would immediately block access to the Chinese market. At that time, China was experiencing a cinema boom in the late 2000s. Naturally, test screenings hinted at the film's poor quality. The studio had no money for reshoots, so the producers decided to digitally change all flags and inscriptions to transform the Chinese into North Koreans. They only had to reshoot a few small scenes. This effort cost around $3 million. However, due to all these issues, Red Dawn sat on the shelf for over 2 years, only reaching theaters in late 2012. By then, it could no longer harm Hemsworth's career. After Thor, he starred in The Avengers and signed on for Snow White and the Huntsman. Red Dawn only managed to gross $51 million against a $65 million budget, receiving scathing reviews from critics and audiences alike. The release of The Avengers in 2012 overshadowed everything happening with the actors from this film. The success was so colossal that even Warner Brothers, running alongside, burst with envy. The studio is still recovering from the effects today. In the future, we'll definitely discuss the tragic demise of the DC Universe. At the box office, The Avengers grossed over $1.5 billion with a $220 million budget. Chris Hemsworth earned less than $1 million for his role in the film. The Avengers was released in April 2012, and by May, a new blockbuster featuring Chris Hemsworth, Snow White and the Huntsman, hit theaters. In the early stages of the film's production, the studio wanted actor Viggo Mortensen for the lead role. This was entirely the Lord of the Rings' fault. The studio wanted to bring Viggo back with a sword and let him swing it around again. However, Viggo wasn't happy with the script, and after lengthy negotiations, he declined the role. Chris Hemsworth was less picky and was fine with the script. They just replaced the sword with something more suitable for his height and build. Chris later shared that he thoroughly enjoyed filming. His weapon was similar to Thor's, and all he had to do was run around and hit someone. However, he did suffer a bit. In one scene, actress Kristen Stewart misjudged a strike and hit Hemsworth in the eye. After that, he had to spend several hours with the makeup artist hiding the bruise. The take with that strike was left in the film. The film's impressive budget wasn't due to any production issues. Director Rupert Sanders insisted the film should look as realistic as possible. As a result, the studio built a real castle for the film. Its construction took over 6 months. The throne room alone took another 3 months to build. However, the film didn't perform very well at the box office. With a $170 million budget, it grossed only $397 million. However, there was one key factor blamed for the movie's less than stellar earnings: The Avengers. The massive success of The Avengers crushed other films released around the same time. For example, 1 week after The Avengers, the $100 million Dark Shadows was released, and 2 weeks later came the $200 million Battleship. Both films heroically perished under the massive weight of The Avengers. It's believed even films released weeks later were affected. These included Snow White and the Huntsman and Men in Black 3. The assumption is they missed out on part of their box office because The Avengers was still earning $20.40 million per weekend. This explains the risk the studio took with the sequel to Snow White and the Huntsman. In 2013, Hemsworth finally got a somewhat different kind of film. For his role in Rush, he had to lose over 30 pounds. This happened simultaneously with the filming of Thor: The Dark World and The Avengers. The actor claims he had to suffer a lot as he needed to lose weight in a very short time. The film Rush was essentially a fluke. Initially, it was meant to be a small movie with some archival footage. Screenwriter Peter Morgan wrote the script on his own initiative, simply because he wanted to. He thought the script would only interest a small independent European studio. However, when he showed it to director Ron Howard, with whom he had worked on Frost/Nixon, Howard was thrilled with the idea. He promised to find the money and personally direct the film. Howard secured $40 million and cast Hemsworth in the lead role. At the time, Chris was filming The Avengers, and his performance impressed the director so much that he immediately invited him to the project. However, it later turned out that Hemsworth couldn't fit into a race car. Rush didn't become a big box office success, earning only $90 million. But this kind of film's financial shortfall doesn't harm anyone. Critics and audiences praised the movie, and it received numerous nominations. However, most of the recognition went to Daniel Bruhl, and Chris didn't get any nominations. That said, he was occasionally told he did a great job. The second Thor is probably the first film in the Marvel Universe that faced heavy criticism. The movie suffered for 2 main reasons. To be precise, there could be more, but 2 had a serious impact on the plot and the main characters. The initial plot was very different from what ended up in the final film. This was largely due to Tom Hiddleston and Natalie Portman. The former gained popularity among audiences in The Avengers, which necessitated his inclusion in the second Thor. In the early script, much more time was dedicated to the Dark Elves. However, since The Avengers was released in mid-spring and filming for the second Thor was set to begin in early September, many changes had to be made in a rush to incorporate Loki into the film. As for Natalie Portman, she was unhappy when Patty Jenkins, who later directed 2 Wonder Woman films, was removed from the project. Portman didn't like this turn of events and tried to leave the project. However, she was prevented from doing so with the threat of various penalties. Fearing sanctions, Portman stayed but began demanding more screen time for her character. A storyline where her character turns into a villain was even removed from the plot. Moreover, during her scenes with Chris Hemsworth, she insisted on using a box to avoid looking too short. She also wanted to punch Thor, and this was added at her request. Later, her performance in this film would be widely mocked. It's believed she walked back and forth with the same expression due to all this drama, not because she was a bad actress. This rush led to constant script changes during filming, and scenes were frequently reworked. As a result, Idris Elba and Christopher Eccleston were particularly frustrated. Idris shared that he was supposed to film for just a couple of weeks, but then he'd get calls asking him to return because of some issue. After returning home from such calls, he'd often get another call within a week, saying the issue had returned and he needed to shoot again. Chris Hemsworth, however, was the least upset. He was allowed to improvise whenever he wanted. As a result, some of the jokes in the film came from his improvisation. When the film was completed, it somehow didn't please the test audience, and director Alan Taylor was removed from the editing process. He claims that the version released in theaters bore little resemblance to his vision. After Taylor's removal, Marvel producers took over the editing process, further distorting the already troubled film. However, the success of The Avengers had boosted the box office for all Marvel films so much that even the heavily criticized second Thor grossed $644 million against a $170 million budget. In 2014, Chris had no film releases. To be precise, one was supposed to come out, but its premiere was postponed due to its extraordinary quality. That film was Black Hat, directed by Michael Mann. The movie was heavily criticized partly because of Hemsworth himself. Hackers are typically portrayed differently, and the almost 2-meter-tall Chris was the exact opposite of those portrayals. Released in early 2015, Black Hat grossed only $19 million against a $70 million budget. In many countries, it went straight to home media. A relative bright spot for the actor was his small role in the comedy Vacation. While it barely turned a profit, it was still considered a failure, as it was meant to be a light reboot of a well-known film series starring Chevy Chase, which had performed well in theaters in the mid-1980s. The costly In the Heart of the Sea, however, sank completely. Instead of Hemsworth, Henry Cavill could have sunk, but Chris outperformed him in the auditions. Cavill, meanwhile, set off to fail with the movie The Man from U.N.C.L.E. In the Heart of the Sea also faced a delay, from spring 2015 to December of the same year. Officially, the delay was explained as an attempt to aim for award potential, which was noticed by major experts. However, it was later revealed that the real issue was test screenings. Viewers fell asleep during the film, and something had to be done. After the disastrous test screenings, almost the entire first third of the movie was cut. This part featured Chris Hemsworth wandering around the harbor, gazing intensely toward the horizon, touching his wife in various places, and meeting different unnecessary characters who were also staring off into the distance. The harbor adventures were reduced to the first 10 minutes. When it was finally released in December 2015, In the Heart of the Sea faced competition from Alvin and the Chipmunks, which crushed it. Additionally, theaters were still showing Star Wars Episode 7 and The Hunger Games, which also steamrolled Hemsworth's film. The movie about an aggressive sperm whale managed to gross only $94 million against a $100 million budget. 2015 could have been a disaster for the actor, but as usual, the safety net of Avengers: Age of Ultron saved the day. While this was the first truly problematic Marvel film, requiring significant cuts and reshoots, it didn't affect the box office much. Age of Ultron grossed $1.4 billion, so Hemsworth's career weathered the storm, and new box office flops were already scheduled for 2016. It was assumed that both Kristen Stewart and Chris Hemsworth would return to their roles in the sequel to the film Snow White and the Huntsman, and Rupert Sanders would once again direct. However, due to the unsatisfactory box office performance of the first film, and the scandal involving the affair between Kristen Stewart and director Rupert Sanders, the studio decided to abandon a direct continuation and focus on a film about Chris Hemsworth's character. The noise surrounding Stewart and Sanders' affair during the filming of the first movie was extremely intense at the time. Amidst this, Rupert began divorcing his wife and apologized to everyone. Robert Pattinson, who was dating Stewart at the time, shared how everything suddenly died inside him and he cried into his pillow at night. Kristen Stewart also apologized, spoke about sun flares, and after all these horrors, shifted her attention to women. In short, the scandal was massive, and the studio got scared. It was also claimed that this clever move would help reduce the film's budget, although most likely the budget was cut due to the modest results of the first movie. The studio simply hoped that the film could still bring in some money through home media sales, and its potential was generally noticeable. So while the first film cost $170 million, the second was made for $115 million, and the reduced budget is quite evident in the film itself. And if the first movie in 2012 barely broke even with home media and TV rights sales, the sequel failed outright without any caveats. With a budget of $115 million, it managed to earn only $165 million. As a result, the planned third installment dissolved into oblivion. That same year, Chris appeared in another comedy, once again in a supporting role. Perhaps he had fun, but it was likely the most criticized film of 2016, so it had no chance at the box office. Ghostbusters grossed only $229 million against a budget of $144 million. Two major failures could have sunk the actor once again, but in 2017, the third Thor was released. For his role in this film, the actor earned $15 million. For comparison, he received $5 million for Avengers: Age of Ultron and only $400,000 for the first Thor. The third Thor performed excellently at the box office, grossing $853 million against a budget of $180 million. It's hard to say how many actors and actresses would sell their souls for such a lifeline. In 2018, Chris failed again with two films, 12 Strong and Bad Times at the El Royale. Both films were relatively modestly budgeted. 12 Strong cost $35 million and grossed $68 million. Considering theater deductions and marketing expenses, this resulted in a decent loss. but there's a chance the film later broke even with digital platform and TV sales. However, Bad Times at the El Royale sank without a chance, earning only $31 million against a budget of $32 million. Interestingly, audience ratings for it are significantly higher than for 12 Strong, but such films are harder to advertise and connect with viewers. And yes, that same year saw the release of Avengers: Infinity War, which grossed over $2 billion at the box office. For it, the actor also earned $15 million. So these minor pricks from El Royale and 12 Strong likely went unnoticed by him. In 2019, the actor tried to get his hands on another major franchise, Men in Black International. For a long time, producers wanted to combine the 21 Jump Street and Men in Black series. It sounds strange, but both series were box office successes, and in theory, it could have been something amusing. However, prolonged negotiations between the producers led nowhere. 21 Jump Street producer Neil Moritz refused to split the profits in the way proposed by the Men in Black franchise producers. As a result, the idea was scrapped, and the creators of Men in Black opted for a light reboot of the series. The screenplay by Art Markham and Matt Holloway was selected for development. This was the script Chris Hemsworth signed onto. It was said that the script was current and topical, focusing heavily on migration issues and even containing serious dramatic elements. But in 2018, right before production began, David Boebert, Sony's vice president of production, left the studio. He had been overseeing the new film and was enthusiastic about the script. After his departure, the script and leadership of the project fell into the hands of producers Walter Parkes and Laurie MacDonald. Parkes and MacDonald were dissatisfied with the original script, feeling that the film was heading in the wrong direction. Even though filming had already begun, this didn't save the script, which was heavily rewritten. It went so far that actors were given pages with dialogue on the day of shooting. Director F. Gary Gray was furious about the situation and attempted to leave the film several times. The studio stopped him only through threats. On set, conflicts between him and the producers often led to producer Walter Parkes personally directing various scenes. Hemsworth and Tessa Thompson, frustrated with the situation, hired their own dialogue writers, as they were dissatisfied with what the producers provided and demanded revisions. When filming ended, two versions of the film were presented to the studio, one by producer Walter Parkes and another by director F. Gary Gray. The studio chose the producer's version, which was released in theaters. Rumors suggested that Parkes' version was selected simply because it was almost finished, while Gray's version would have required additional millions to complete. Since the studio aimed to keep the budget within $100 million, the decision was made to go with the producer's cut. Without F. Gary Gray's version, it's hard to say whether Walter Parkes and Laurie MacDonald saved the film or buried it deeper. The finished film grossed $253 million against a $110 million budget. No one dared to continue with this light reboot, and now there's much talk about rebooting the franchise entirely, without any lightness. As usual, Chris Hemsworth covered up this failure with Avengers: Endgame. Released around the same time as Men in Black International, it grossed $2.8 billion, surpassed only by the first Avatar. In 2020, COVID-19 arrived, and streaming platforms surged, becoming a lifeline for many less fortunate actors. After failing with 5 consecutive films unrelated to the Marvel Universe, Hemsworth decided to try his hand at Netflix. In terms of box office flops, this was a win-win option since streaming doesn't have public failures, or if it does, only the platform's accounting knows about it. The plot of Extraction is simple but present. It's essentially one of those scripts that could fit on a single notebook page. If you remove the fascinating dialogue, it might even fit on a notepad. Despite this, Extraction became one of Netflix's top hits by view count. This success secured Hemsworth's position on the platform, with the exception of Thor: Love and Thunder, which, although it started to decline like much of Marvel's output, still avoided a box office failure. Another Netflix film by the actor Spiderhead didn't make any top viewing lists. However, how poorly it performed remains unknown due to the lack of data. The Extraction sequel performed well again, although it slightly lagged behind the first part. So it's safe to say Hemsworth is doing fine on Netflix. However, with theatrical releases, the actor, outside of Marvel projects, continues to struggle. In May 2024, Furiosa: A Mad Max Saga hit the screens. Despite receiving good reviews from both audiences and critics, it failed epically at the box office, grossing $173 million against a $168 million budget. Today, Marvel Studios isn't doing so well either, with box office revenue dropping significantly and some films even flopping. Hemsworth has plans for a 5th Thor, but it's unclear when it will be released. Perhaps his lifeline will vanish somewhere in the near future. Thank you for your attention, and stay tuned.